Okay. Well, we are past our time, so I will be brief. And let me just say that this conference began because Tom and I are always sort of collaborating, coming up with ideas with our students, ways to engage them. I have been working for over 20 years on oil extraction in the Amazon, so you'll have to excuse me. My dealings with Halliburton have been not in the United States, Dr. Rao, but and so my experience with natural gas is very limited. But I have a lot of experience with stakeholders. That's what I've been doing for over 20 years in the Amazon and more recently in the Galapagos on fossil fuel issues there. And what I find about our conversations today is that we are powering America in a global capacity. And Tom and I have always found that when we're talking with our students, it's best to engage them at a level that they can see. And I feel privileged to be able to sit among them today and to sit among Virginia Ann and Tom, who have single-handedly funded this entire conference, and I thank you for that. They very generously have promoted Coastal Carolina University out of their, not out of self-interest, but to our interest, and we greatly appreciate your interest in our university and directly with our students. And thank you to all of you for coming. It is critically important. It sounds sexy to go to the Amazon and go to the Galapagos, and so for me, it's always been very easy to attract students to this topic area. However, it's not very sexy, as you can see from that picture, and nor is it feasible to bring them there. And so our ability to go to North Carolina to meet with the hydraulic fracturing community, the stakeholders, and to meet with Dr. Rao today, to meet with all of you, is critical to the development of our students, not just as future scholars and researchers, but as future citizens of South Carolina. Maybe you'll all stay, but future citizens of our planet. So in that context, when I think about extraction, I think a lot about what we said today, and that sign says, petroleum constructs roadways towards development. Boy, that sounds really familiar from what we said today. If you notice, the sign is really dirty. And if you look, I was an academic observer. This, of course, is the worst example of oil extraction. It's from the Chevron Texaco oil pits. From the 1970s. Chevron Texaco operated in this area of the Cuyabeno Reserve, which is now a nature preserve, from 1971 to 1993. This, if you can see something white right over there, that's a rock I threw on top of the heavy Napo crude at 14.7 API. And this is an example of what people live next to. So when I think about stakeholders, I think about not the United States, but I think about the extreme extraction places that I've seen in the Amazon. And right after I taught in the Galapagos last semester, the fossil fuel delivery ship that tipped over to its side, and they were just devastated that it might pollute the sea right up actually on the beach across from the university campus that I was at, and that Tom and Brian and some of his family will be at next week. So in these extreme extraction places, they're places that people in the United States, when we think about getting our energy, we don't think about. These are places that a lot of times scholars call sacrifice zones. And quite frankly, people in the United States haven't cared. So yet I see hope in what we talked about today, because these extreme extraction zones, and what I see in the United States, this is our country, these are our towns, these are our neighborhoods, and maybe even our backyards. And so now what I think is important is that it's in the larger context of our own country. And that means we have to see these places, we have to take responsibility for them, we own them. And so in that way, I see natural gas as not only a revolution of energy or the economy, but a global revolution of global responsibility. Responsibility that we take care here in the home front and even in South Carolina. And so with that responsibility, we have stakeholders. I want to just bring up a point that we talked about in terms of geopolitical politics. International relations is my field of study. And my recent study that I'm just about to publish is on China's investment in the lesser developed world. And I'm talking about conventional, right? I'm not talking about natural gas right now. But there's so much overlap to what we're talking about. I find it fascinating. And what General Smith talked about was the issue of private property in the United States, which greatly overlaps in woody biomass, and I won't get into that. But the other point is not just private property, but private companies. And for many, many years, the lesser developed world, particularly some of the governments now that I'm more familiar with in South America, complained about the role of neoliberal capitalism and multinational corporations eating all the profits out of their country. And while that may not have been very untrue, what they're finding is the new Beijing consensus, as opposed to the Washington consensus, is far worse. It's a publicly owned company. And from the interviews that I did, and these are interviews that you have to do very carefully because there's high security levels involved, with some of the attorneys involved with PetroAndes, which is the Chinese company that operates in the Amazon. There's no stakeholder involvement because there's no shareholders for these companies. So there's no pressure from a democratic citizenry. And so the regulations that Dr. Rao talked about in North Carolina, while they may exist in the domestic law of Amazonian countries, they're not being enforced. In fact, a friend of a friend sent via email to me a picture of a Chinese worker camp in tents, hundreds of people in tents that weren't supposed to be there. He was jailed and had to escape the country because he was leaking this information out. So what I say is, the equation of energy security means, those little boxes we're all supposed to memorize, means economic freedom and national security. For many years, that economic freedom never diffused downward to many local communities that live near this. So if you want to know why there's stakeholder engagement problems with the natural gas industry, it's because fossil fuel industry in general has gotten a bad rap. I am utterly heartened as a researcher, having worked among stakeholders, in hearing some of the engagement processes that we have going on. But I will say that the equation of energy security towards economic and national diplomatic freedom, with the regulations that we've talked about today, with the supply chains that we've talked about today, and I want to just talk about some of the private authority that we've found. One of the other interesting initiatives in international relations that we've looked at, we've missed, and it's something that General Smith touched on, a very traditional role of looking at politics, which is hard politics, which is military, or sometimes hard politics with energy and economics, which is kind of a soft hard politics. Another type, though, of politics that we can talk about is private authority, the really significant role that corporations play on a global level, but informing regimes that are not actually created at the federal or international level, meaning with federal law or international law. So I want to just point out that what Mr. Tramuto talked about, the One Future program, there's other programs such as the Coalition for Sustainable Gas Development in Pennsylvania. These are corporations that are getting together that are self-regulating. And there is an international self-regulation body, and it's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And there's a big push from stakeholders to engage these corporations in self-regulating and then implementing these regulations at federal, state, and local levels. I know we're short on time. Two other things, and then I will close. In terms of economic issues, we've talked a lot about economic benefit for South Carolina and for the country. I will say, well, actually, maybe three things. The first thing is There's the Global Climate Fund that we've all heard about, especially Professor Mulliken in his climate change class. And that is one of the things that we're looking at in the United Nations in 2015, September, in the passage of the Future Sustainable Development Goals. It's going to guide development, especially where you guys are going, for quite a while. If our natural gas industry, and there is precedent for this with banks, it's the Basel Convention, if our natural gas industry can self-regulate, for the first time unlike the Millennium Development Goals, multinational corporations are going to be a part of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Climate Change Fund. That could be a huge game changer then if natural gas industry infuses money into that through the Global Compact Initiative of multinational corporations in the United Nations for adaptation and mitigation processes. So spreading that technology that Ron talked about, but to places like where you're going in Africa, South America, Asia, all over the planet. So that's the economic component we haven't talked about. And then, let me see. I will say that in closing, when we went to North Carolina and we engaged with stakeholders, and I've found this in my conventional petroleum extraction research, it's the beginning stages of communication that often, it's the prior informed consent that are often the most difficult and often lacking. And it seems to me that the education that Dr. Ireland talked about in Texas and some of the other initiatives going on are really great pathways to engaging that prior informed consent and communities. And then in closing, we really do face as a country a debate on our democracy, and natural gas in some ways is right at the heart of it. The organization that we're talking about on moratoria is an organization that I've studied because they implemented a constitutional amendment in Ecuador for rights of nature. It's the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I sat next to Ben Price of that, and they're based in Pennsylvania. They're going around Tamaqua, Pennsylvania, Santa Monica, all the places that we've mentioned, Denton and others, and they're asking people to rethink about their local rights and their local property rights. So they're engaging private property in a very different way, saying that we own our private property and we have a right of a municipality to reject the natural gas industry or hydraulic fracturing. It is a legitimate debate in the United States, and what's interesting is it touched in North Carolina. The people in North Carolina told us that they have been speaking with CELDEF. I think CELDEF is a little too West Coast for the North Carolinians, so I don't know that it really will take effect. But it has been a significant variable in terms of engaging the private property debate in a very different way than we've talked about here, and I just point that out. I want to thank you again for engaging our Powering America series, because I think with young people like this and professionals like you all, we're also powering the globe. Thank you very much.